we go. Hey, what's up, guys? I'm Travis, and this is my amazing wife, Johanna, and this is Seeking God in the Wait.
Yeah, and today we just want to talk a little bit about purity and just the compromise of purity.
Did you just say purity?
I did.
Okay, good.
We just really feel like there's such an attack on purity these days, and I think it's always been that case, but we just see it a lot. We've seen it a lot in our own lives, but also in the people around us, where we just feel like God is pure and He's called us to be pure, and Satan is out to kill, steal, and destroy that purity in our lives. What does it look like to fight for purity? What does it look like to compromise? What is the consequence of compromising purity in our lives and in our relationships?
So today we're going to talk a little bit about my story. I know both of us have different stories kind of coming from different backgrounds.
Which we talked about last time.
And if you rewind a little bit, go back and watch that one. But for me, again, not being raised in the church and being inundated with the ideology of this world and what is okay and what's not okay, we get to the point of age 18. Since we're moving forward in this.
Right. What happened when you were 18?
So when I was 18, I actually was engaged. I asked a girl to marry me.
Let's just,
Jagged Edge, that was the name of it, by the way. Let's get married, and that's what I did. So I wanted to be the first one. I wanted to impress my family with being the first one to be engaged.
Although you're the third child.
Although I'm the third child syndrome. It's real. It's real. And for me, I wanted to come out with a bang and do something awesome, and that's what it was. After that, I got engaged, put a ring on it, and
to a really nice girl.
She's pretty awesome, pretty amazing at the time. But this is where our conversation today is about compromise. That's kind of the part of this story in my life was where I started to learn what compromise was and how destructive it really is in relationships.
Because you had initially heard about the idea of keeping sex for marriage, like going into marriage in a pure way, right? When you were a teenager.
Once again, it was a pastor that spoke about it, and it was just this concept of, saving it for your wife. And that was new to me, but for some reason it just sat really well with me, and I just wanted it to be what I implemented in my life. So all throughout high school, come to everything was good, and then got engaged, and then that was the point where again I was kind of walking in my faith, not really, but I just started to compromise in my mind and in my head. And once you get engaged, for some reason, my thought was, hey, we're kind of married already. Like this.
Well, we've already said we're gonna get married.
We're gonna get married. This is it. Like the only thing that we have to do is say I do.
Right.
So for me, I started to think, hey, it's okay. Like, it's all right. Like we can actually pretend like we're married, like we're engaged. Right. It's kind of in my mind equivalent, although it really wasn't. Not even close. And so got involved in doing certain things, and it really was a turning point, I think. I started to learn compromise is destructive.
How did that play out for you, or what were your thoughts? Or
So for me, a little bit of background history. There was some sexual immorality in my life personally that I was dealing with that had a huge impact on the relationship itself. Like the relationship. So the more involved I was with those things, it just so happened to kind of tear us apart more and more. So once you finally make a decision and kind of go all the way and do that, there's a lot that comes with it. There's a lot that comes with it that nobody really ever talks about because people just kind of sweep it under the rug and it's not a big deal. But for me, looking back and realizing it was a lot of shame and guilt, right? A lot of shame and guilt, and this idea of I so badly wanted to save everything for marriage, but it just didn't end up that way. And once you live in that and you see that, you start to feel guilty about your decisions, and then it's just a compromise from that point forward. It's like, it's okay. Well, we already did it, so what's going to hurt to do it one more time?
Right.
And then
or
one
why
more time.
stop now?
And why stop now? Like, we've already done it. Like, we're going to get married anyways.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah.
And that's just kind of the way it was.
Yeah. So it's just like one compromise after another compromise. Being influenced by the thoughts of this world, being influenced by what media tells you, what movies tell you, what people around talk about, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it's kind of one of those things, what you feed yourself too. If you're feeding yourself stuff that's not pure, then you're going to try to live out an impure life. So we ended up actually breaking it off. But for the situation, the way it was is I was feeling guilty. I really was living in sin. I was doing things that, was causing my mind to kind of become impure in thoughts that were not really of God. And that just caused me to pretty much just want to get out of the relationship. And through that, once a guy has kind of made up his mind, or even a woman, like for that, they've kind of made up their mind and they've kind of thought things, not gone down like the path that they were originally going through. It's easy to kind of find ways out of it. And for me, what that looked like was, instead of just breaking it off after having all that guilt and shame and doubts and everything that I was dealing with, it was more of, hey, let's make this relationship horrible, right?
Like uncomfortable.
Like, I'm going to make it uncomfortable so maybe I can get her to break it off with me, right? So that way I'm still the good guy. I'm still the guy that's like, hey, like, it wasn't my fault. She's the one that walked away from me. I tried everything that I possibly could. But the reality is, I was the one that initiated it. I was the one that was leading the divide, and a lot of that had to do with my sexual immorality and my sinfulness and what I was doing. And and as nobody wants to be the person that looks bad, right? So they want to be the victim.
Yeah.
So if I can make them, walk away from me and say, hey, it's all my fault. It's all my fault, and have them put the blame on me. Then, hey, I tried, right?
Right.
And that's just the way it was. And that is what I find today is very, very common too. Like, a lot of people don't want to be they want to be the victim and not the person that actually.
Right. You don't want to be the one to blame.
Right.
So it's easier to come up with something that, to put it on them. I think that's the original sin we...
Yeah, wasn't that Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
Eve's like, the devil made me do it.
Yeah. Yeah, but, and that just shows how one compromise leads to another compromise, to another, to another. And I think, like, even though you had that concept of, maybe it would be really cool to keep, my virginity for marriage, how easily, though, you were convinced of otherwise. And it's almost like you kind of made it to sound right in your head. Like, we're pretty much married. We're already engaged.
Right.
So you kind of twist reality to make it okay to still live out what you think is right. But you did feel shame and guilt.
Yeah, of course. And again, once you put your mind to something, and especially something that's something that's of God and it's good, and you're striving for that. So what the devil always does is, as soon as you make that mistake, well, here he comes. Like, what? Like, you did it. Like, this idea of like putting the guilt and shame on you, and living with that. It's just really hard to do, right? So sometimes the easiest thing to do is just run from it, instead of hitting your problems head on and figuring things out. It's like, hey, I'll just get out of here and get out of this relationship and go do something else.
Leave this chapter.
Right.
Instead of like cleaning it up or saying, hey, or addressing it? Were you even able to address
I don't think I wanted
whole
to address
issue?
it.
No?
I think, again, once I was living in my sinful nature.
Not really walking with the
Not
Lord.
really walking with the Lord, and I enjoyed it. And that was the one thing that in my mind, hey, I'm still young. There's plenty of other women out there, like, it's not a big deal. Like, let's move on. But here's the thing is through that, there's a lot of destruction. A lot of, once you break into something that you've tried to save your whole life until marriage, and that breaks, there's a lot of compromise that comes after that too. It's like, oh, okay, well,
it's just easier.
Yeah, I've done it before. It's not a big deal. Like, who cares? Like, I can't give my future wife that one thing that I wanted to give anymore. So it doesn't matter if it's one person or 600 people.
Which I hope it wasn't.
Thank God I didn't fall into that.
Okay.
But I'm just talking about for other
Right,
people. It's
in
real easy. It's like
general.
once you've broken that seal, your virginity seal, then from that point it's easy to be like, okay, well,
Right.
I don't have it anymore anyway, so it doesn't really matter.
Right,
Like, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
So that was.
So what was the turning point for you in all of this? I mean, you broke off the relationship, or I guess you mutually broke it off. And then...
Well, technically I broke it off and made her think that it was a mutual thing. Again, here's the thing, is guys can be very manipulative, even if we don't try to be. So women, know that, please, because you guys got to protect yourself.
Yeah.
And so it's really easy to and especially when there's emotions involved, and when there's your first, then at that point, like, there's a huge attachment that comes with that.
Yeah.
So manipulating after that point, it's even easier. So so all that to say, it was more of me, and which I have taken full responsibility for understanding and realizing, like, hey, this was me. Like, I did this.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of that is one thing we have to realize as men, is really understanding, like, we have to take responsibility for our actions. Like, women, for the most point, and again, there's different scenarios and different women out there, but for the most point, women are they're followers. Like, they want to find a man that they can follow, and
who will lead.
Right? And if the man's not leading them well, they're gonna still follow. And unfortunately, it's both parties' fault in one sense, because the man is the guy that's kind of leading, and if he's leading her astray,
He should be leading.
But at the same time, women still have to protect themselves.
Yeah.
They still got to have those boundaries and still walk in purity and holiness. And so to your question, like, well, what did that look like after? I think it still took time to realize what I was doing, because for me it was, I had to move away from where I was living, move into a new town, and fully devote myself to Christ. And then in that's when God started to speak to me, and God started to put people back in my path and saying, hey, let's live a righteous life, let's live a life. And that's the beautiful thing about it, is in God there is forgiveness, right? And I messed up and I did a lot of things I shouldn't have done, but in that, God still forgave me, right? And I think sometimes we have to sit in that and realize that just because you've compromised once, doesn't mean you have to keep compromising, right?
Or you're bound to compromise.
Or we're bound to compromise, Like, in Christ, we have been forgiven, and we can walk in that. And that's the beautiful thing about it.
So you, years down the road, gave your life to the Lord, like, or fully dedicated to the Lord. You're walking with the Lord, and that's when you decide, like, okay, I'm done with that lifestyle. I'm done with that compromise.
Well, I would love to say yes and be like, hey, I'm perfect, and everything was perfect after that. But the reality is, like, I have had many choices along the way, haven't always made the best choices, and have had to look back at my life, or now I can say I can look back at my life and say, hey, those were the areas that I messed up, right? And then when it got to our relationship, which we'll talk about a little bit later, things were different, because I had learned how to do things the right way and do things that were blessed in God's eyes, opposed to satisfying my desires, my sexual desires.
Yeah. And I mean, it is a journey. Life is a journey where we walk and we look back. We're able to look back. And I love how you said that, like God's grace, if we do realize like what we've done. And I think you just realizing like, hey, that's not really what God's called us to. And yeah, that there's forgiveness in that. And always a chance to make a new decision and to walk in purity, even after having compromised it. And I think that's where it's so sweet how when we did meet and we started dating, just being able to put lay that foundation from the beginning and say like, we want to walk in purity. And not compromise.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is, and it's interesting because I'm hard-headed sometimes, and it's like, tell me something, and I'm gonna have to go figure things out for myself. Like I have to do it. Thank God, not everything has been like that. And I've learned from a lot of amazing people that have kind of walked me through. But one thing was said along the way is this idea of like, as soon as purity is broken, as soon as purity becomes impure and you allow things into your relationship, that's when the destruction comes in. And again, that comes back to, well, I can look back at all my relationships and the people that I've talked to, and there's always a point of like, everything is good, but as soon as guilt and shame comes in, it starts to change things. Right? And it starts to break things down. So that's what the enemy wants. That's what the devil wants, is to come in and destroy things, good things, right?
Even good relationships.
Yeah, relationships, they're actually
that
a good
have
thing.
a lot of potential. Yeah.
But even the best relationships can be broken once there's, sexual immorality in it. And that's not to say that God can't change. Like if you're sleeping with your boyfriend, your girlfriend right now, it's not to say that God can't come in and fix it, but you have to be obedient to what God has called us to do, which is choose to live a pure life. So that means stop sleeping with your boyfriend and girlfriend, right? Stop doing these things that is bringing destruction into your relationship. And God can reconcile those things.
Why is there guilt and shame attached to, like, sleeping with your partner or whoever, even if it's just a one-night stand before marriage?
Well, I think there's something special about sex. I think God created sex for a man or a husband and a wife to bring that unity, right? So when we get married, we're making a covenant to God, and there's something special about that should never be broken, right? And sex is that binding factor that kind of comes in and says, hey, this is the
you are one.
The binding in it. So I think when you do that, you're binding yourself to somebody, right? Outside of marriage and outside of what God wants. So there's going to be guilt because anytime we do something that we shouldn't be doing, something that God doesn't want us to do, you're going to feel guilt because it's wrong, right? And especially if you're trying to follow God and you go against Him. I mean, it's kind of like a good father in your life that you love, and all of a sudden you go out and do something just to break His heart, and maybe not intentionally, but there's something that breaks His heart, and in that, like, there's that brokenness, and kind of it's the same thing with God. Like when we go, we break that with God, then there's like a brokenness. Yeah,
even in your relationship with Him. Yeah. But did you feel like you were able to restore that with the Lord, and you were able to?
That is the beauty about God. That is the beauty about God, is this idea of God is a forgiving Father that loves us. But I think, like it definitely took a lot of restoration in my life to look back and be like, well, here's the thing, is once I started walking with Christ, that's when things started changing, right? So how much guilt and shame I was feeling before I was walking with Christ, it's hard to say because I didn't really care about what God had to say in my life. But now that I'm like, hey, I want to follow God, and following God means doing this, this, and this. And if you're not doing this, that's where the guilt and shame comes in. So when you start being obedient and listening to God and doing what he says, you start to see a whole different lifestyle. And it's there is no guilt, there is no shame. And we'll talk about that in our story in that episode. But I mean, when we got married, everything was like freedom. Like I feel free. I don't feel any shame. I don't feel any guilt. And everything that we did was like, hey, this is awesome. Like so much freedom, as you know. And I think that's the blessing about this is seeing both sides, is walking in guilt and shame, walking in doubt, and seeing the other side of things is doing things right, and seeing the fruits of, the blessings that come with that too.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, like, just to touch on that a little bit, just in comparison to compromise, when I met Travis, we were dating long distance for a while, and then...
Which was very helpful.
As far as that goes, yes.
Very helpful.
It was good because, you don't focus so much on the physical part and the emotions, and you more concentrate on just communicating, asking the questions, asking the hard questions, really getting to know a person. And then when we did meet in person, even before we met, he had asked me, he was like, hey, like, do you have certain like boundaries, physical boundaries? And I said, yeah, I actually, I do.
And
I appreciated him like even thinking along those lines. And then when we did meet in person, and we, after the first couple of interactions with each other, had really quickly actually touched on that topic. And he said, I said, just so you know, like, I really want us to be careful and to be, not to get too close physically. And just so that we don't cross any boundaries that we really don't want to cross. And he looked at me and he was like, yeah, I fully agree. He said, I wouldn't even kiss you. And I was like, what? But I wanted
She wanted a big smooch.
I wanted a kiss, or like, at least at the end of my time with him. Or I wouldn't have minded, let's put it that way. And
you wanted a big smooch, come on.
And I asked him why, or what his reasoning was behind that. And he said, I know myself, and I know, just looking back at some of the mistakes that I have made or compromises I've made. And he said, to be honest, I just respect you too much to cross those boundaries, with you. And not kissing you, it's not that kissing is the ultimate sin, or it's that one thing you should be saving for marriage, but rather he said it's a boundary around my boundaries. And I just thought that was the most, I don't know, it was so impressive to me that this guy who isn't like, I don't know, this, what's the word I'm looking for?
Awesome?
He's an amazing guy.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, there you go.
who still like decided, I want to do things right. I respect you, and I respect you physically. And this is how I want to protect that space. And I said, sweet, then let's do that. I'm on board with that boundary, even though I wouldn't have minded a kiss. But ultimately, I think it was looking back, it was a really, really wise decision to wait, even to kiss, because one thing quickly or slowly, sometimes really quickly, leads into the next thing. And it was really that concept of like putting a boundary around your boundary, in order to just put on the brakes early on.
So here's what I'm going to say to all you women out there is the reality is, if a man really, really, really loves you and cares for you and respects you, he's not going to try to get in your pants. He's not going to try to sleep with you. Because if he wants to do what is right in the ways of the Lord, he's going to respect you enough to keep you pure. And he's going to take on that responsibility to put those boundaries up or whatever else needs to be done. So women, if you find a guy out there that all he wants to do is get in your pants, run, flee. And no matter how much he says he loves you, the reality is he doesn't. Because if he loves you, he's going to keep you pure and keep himself pure in that. What would you say for the guys out there?
Yeah, I think, I think guys, our world has inundated us with so much impurity and with so much, so many lies of what is love and what does that look like. And I think there's so much temptation around our relationships. And yeah, definitely there's a war on your purity and on your relationships. So I just want to encourage you men to step up and, make a decision to either change your ways or, to move forward in purity, and to really have clear thoughts think about these things before you're in a tempting situation. Think about what you are willing to do, what you're not willing to do, what's going to help you to keep those boundaries, communicate them clearly when you're in relationships. Don't let seductive women tempt you into anything, and communicate, say, hey, look, this is really hard for me. That's, this is tempting for me. I'm trying to keep us pure. I'm trying to, keep boundaries. And like Travis said, flee temptation. Joseph, when he was tempted by, Potiphar's wife, he didn't even blink. Like, he just ran from the situation. And self-control is just one of those things that is a virtue. And it's a gift of the Holy Spirit. So I just want to encourage you men to rise up and to lead in purity, to put down those boundaries, and to really respect women, and women the same thing. I think it goes both ways for sure. We need to keep each other accountable, but also a wise thing to do is to keep to have people outside of your relationship who know about your boundaries, who have the freedom to ask you about them and how you're doing with them. And if you do slip up, that you can go to and talk to about it with them, and just really do what it takes to fight for that purity in your relationships.
Yeah, because ultimately in the end, it's about marriage, right? That's kind of like the end game in relationships is marriage. And starting off right and building your foundations from the start and doing things according to what God wants is going to create a stronger house in the long run. And I think that's kind of what our heart's desire is for you guys, along with us as we learn and we get real with you, to have that same desire to create and be part of a strong, biblical, godly relationship. So that's it for this episode. I know we have so much more to share with you guys, so we hope that you guys will continue to join us. So we love you guys.
Take care.
Bye.
Till next time.